I think people need to recognize that those of us who have been so much influenced by violence in the media, in particular pornographic violence, are not some kinds of inherent monsters. We are your sons, and we are your husbands, and we grew up in regular families.
America's most beautiful killer. It's hard to imagine that the words handsome to describe a serial killer would include the words handsome, charming. Yet that's exactly how Ted Bundy, one of the bloodiest maniacs in the United States, the victims who were lucky to survive. The exact number of deaths of this ripper and rapist is still unknown, and Ted Bundy's story continues to terrify to children and adults even after his death.
Hi, I'm Ted.
Theodore Robert Cowell was born on 24th November 1946. The place of his birth was the Elizabeth Lund home, a home for unwed mothers in Vermont. Ted did not know his biological father throughout his life. It must be said that the identity of Ted's father has never been authoritatively established. Bundy's birth certificate identifies him one Lloyd Marshall, although Bundy's mother later on said she was a Dia War veteran called Jack Worthington. Louise was 22 years old. She was from a good religious family, and it has to be said that at the time and place where she became pregnant, motherhood outside of marriage was viewed with extreme hostility. Virginity was an end in itself, and girls who were sexually active sexual activity before marriage was not publicized, let alone pregnancy. Come to think of it, maybe if things had happened in this day and age, Ted wouldn't have been born at all. But back then abortion was out of the question. Mrs. Cowell had always liked the name Ted, and so she named her firstborn son. For the first 9 years of his life, Ted and his mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, the oldest of 3 daughters in a kennel worker's family, lived with his maternal grandfather who, according to some family members, suffered from mental illness in Philadelphia. To avoid the censure associated with prejudice against illegitimate children, many neighbors and friends were told that Louise's parents had adopted Ted, and he was in fact her younger brother. According to some sources, which we are inclined to believe, Bundy believed his mother was his older sister. In particular, Bundy biographers Stephen Meekad and Hugh Ainsworth believe that Ted learned that Louise was his mother while he was at secondary school. Ann Rull, who knew Bundy personally, states that this occurred in about 1969 and followed a traumatic breakup with his girlfriend. Ted's background has always been a touchy subject for the Cowell family. In the words of one of its members, it was never talked about. Ted adored his grandfather. He was probably the only person Bundy really respected. The boy often identified with his grandfather, turning to him for advice in times of need. Grandpa also loved his grandson. They spent a lot of time fishing and camping. Ted thought his grandfather was a great man, but the family thought otherwise. They described Sim as a grumpy tyrant. Cowell family members claim that Ted's beloved grandfather was racist, intolerant, and a demanding man. He often insulted family members and sometimes beat his wife and mistreated animals. There are reports that he liked to twirl cats by their tails above their heads, and also that he abused dogs. By the way, Ted himself was never seen for such activities. Ted's grandmother suffered from endless depression. It went so far that she was eventually treated with electric shocks. She also suffered from agoraphobia and never left the house writers and forensic scientists who pored over Ted's story, trying to explain his violent acts, wondered, could it be that his grandfather really was his father, as Ted himself once claimed? When reporters asked Louise Bundy this question, her voice wavered, with none of the indignation one might expect when Ted was 4 years old. He and his mother moved to Tacoma, Washington, where Louise's Uncle Jack taught music at the University of Puget Sound. As Ted himself claimed, the move upset him. He described his early years in Philadelphia as idyllic. recalling how much he loved his grandfather, Cowell, and the comfortable old house where the whole family lived. The little boy didn't understand why he and his sister had to move in with Uncle Jack, why Louise had to leave to start a new life. After moving, Ted's mother changed her son's surname from Cowell to Nelson for reasons only she knew, perhaps hoping to pass as a widow or divorced woman. The earliest memory of Teddy, provided by someone outside the family, is from his first teacher, Mrs. Oyster. Teddy loved his first teacher very much. She once wrote on his report card that Teddy was getting good grades, was sociable, and had good behavior. By his own account, Bundy was confused when Mrs. Oyster went on maternity leave and was replaced by a non-staff teacher. His second teacher Ted describes as a zealous Catholic named Miss Jerry. She was about 5 feet tall, it says Ted, and yet looked like a cannonball ready to explode at any moment. Being a Protestant, Bundy felt Miss Jerry was prejudiced against him. Ted was about 7 or 8 years old and was a very ordinary child in all his faculties. Sometimes he fantasized, especially often imagining himself to be Roy Rogers and Dale Evans of the Roy Rogers show, a series about life on a ranch that ran from 51 to 57 on TV, who had their own ponies and many of the things Teddy wanted but could not have. Louise never really explained to her son that she was actually his mother, not his older sister. Sometimes he called her Mum, sometimes just Louise. Everyone who knew them said that Ted was a child in whom she sensed great potential. To her, he was special. Louise wanted Teddy to go to college and convinced him to start saving for his education when he was only a 13 or 14-year-old teenager. Outwardly, Ted resembled his mother, which you can see in some of the photos if you look closely. He was more Cowell than Bundy and felt like one. Ted got his tall stature from his biological father. In junior high school, he was already taller than both his mother and stepfather. Ted was a Boy Scout and went to church regularly. Teddy became fast friends with 2 boys in the neighborhood, and they remained his closest friends during high school. One of the friends was named Terry Storwick. The other was a chubby boy named Warren Dodge. Both Terry and Warren found that Teddy was fun to be with. He was a great friend, even though he was a little aloof at times. To the question of Teddy's character, behind his house in the Scotch Broom area, the boys were playing gorilla. One afternoon in the heat of battle, Warren hit Teddy below the eye. Teddy immediately felled Warren, and in a rage began to pummel his friend mercilessly. Terry and the other boys dragged him away. The incident is remembered by Terry Storvak, not because the outburst of anger was unusual or particularly strong. No, boys often fight. But because the incident involved Teddy Bundy, that Ted always realized it was just a game, says Terry. It was amazing to see him so involved in the game. When he got hit in the eye, he was definitely absorbed in it. At a picnic at Boy Scout camp, Ted was fighting with a kid named John Moon, hitting him over the head with a stick, recalls Terry Storvik. Deliberately, it was very easy to tell when Ted was angry. His eyes would turn black. I realize this sounds like a cheap romance novel, but you could see it. He had blue eyes with darker veins. When he got hot, they got darker. It wasn't necessarily a fight. Someone could say something nasty to him, and the dark spots seemed to widen. Young Bundy was a terribly shy, insecure boy. In junior high and then high school, he was often teased, taunted, and attacked by local bullies. For example, many of his fellow students recall that Ted did not like common showers, always tried to take a shower in a separate stall, for which he was repeatedly ridiculed and poured cold water.
He was different from the other kids, looking at the others and repeating their actions. But there was something else, fear. Doubt, sometimes just a vague anxiety, endowed his mind with the cunning of a cat. He realized he was different for years, but but could not have imagined what that feeling would develop into after a while. Regardless of the insults, he also suffered from the realization that he was different from other people.
He went through a process of socialization as an alien life form, acquiring appropriate behavior through mimicry and adaptation. It was a painful and confusing process. Often he did not know how to behave in a given situation, making mistakes in his dealings with people that left him in a stupor. Over time, the preoccupation with sex and violence grew. It gave rise to raw fantasies in which Ted began to see himself as an actor and not just a member of the audience. At this age, Ted, by his own statement, encounters outside the home, at the local grocery store and drugstores, unobtrusive pornography.
Young boys, he continues, explore the quiet roads of the neighborhood, the places where people dump rubbish. From time to time, we came across books with more hardcore content and more pictures. It was detective magazines, etc. I want to emphasize that. The most destructive kind of pornography, and I'm speaking from solid, real, personal experience, is the kind that combines violence and sexual violence. The marriage of these two evils, I know this all too well, causes behavior that is too horrible to describe. Years later, already on Florida's death row, Bundy described himself as someone who, from a young age, was fascinated by images of sex and violence. In early prison interviews, Bundy referred to this part of himself as a legal person.
In 1965, he enrolled at the University of Puget Sound, where he safely completed 1 year. For all his contrived seriousness, his grades were only good, not excellent. He left high school in 1965 with a grade just above average. Around 66 to 67, Ted's fantasies progress. This coincides with the time of his first encounter with Stephanie Brooks. He also begins to make his raids on the windows of neighboring houses with frightening regularity. Here's what Ted himself says about it.
One evening, he was walking down the street, quite by accident looked in the window of the nearest house and saw a woman undressing. He liked it and began, with increasing regularity, to peep at women. He would look in the windows and watch women undress, or just watch other people's evening life. He took it very seriously, having done it for many years. All those occasions when he traveled around the neighborhood in search of candidates, places where he could see the things he wanted to see, they were dictated by the demands of his ordinary life. Thus, he did not miss important holidays. He did not postpone important matters. Roughly speaking, he could give time to both his ordinary life and his little hobby. He took great pleasure in it and became more and more skillful at it, as anyone becomes skillful at anything if he does it many times over and over again.
Ted Bundy starts killing. On 4th January 1974, Bundy, in Seattle's University District, broke into the semi-basement room of 18-year-old Karen Sparks, identified in some sources as Joni Lenz or Terry Caldwell, a dancer and student at the University of Washington. He struck the sleeping girl in the head with a metal bar from the bed frame and raped her with a reamer. Sparks suffered extensive internal injuries and permanent brain damage but survived, waking up 10 days after the attack. However, she did not remember anything. Less than a month later, on the night of 31st January to 1st February, Bundy breaks into a house just 2 blocks away from Karen Sparks' house, which was rented by a student, Linda Ann Healy, and 4 of her friends. Bundy walked through the house and into the semi-basement room of Linda Healy, a psychology student at the University of Washington and a radio weather presenter for skiers. He gagged her, tied her up, beat her until she bled, stripped her, then, in his words, performed some sexual acts. Put a pillowcase over her head, wrapped her in a sheet, and took her away with her backpack, jeans, white blouse, and boots. Healy's neighbors, despite the thin walls in the house, heard nothing and thought she had gone to work at the radio station early in the morning as usual. However, Healy did not arrive at work, nor did she show up for class. Her room at first glance was clean and tidy, her bed made without a single wrinkle. The girl seemed to disappear without a trace. As it turned out, after Bundy's first arrest, his attack on Healy was not random. He had recently studied with her in the same psychology class at the University of Washington. His cousin knew Healy, and his credit card statement showed that he had been following her for several days before the kidnapping. Students continued to go missing at a rate of about one a month. On 12th March, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College, went to a jazz concert but never showed up. On 17th April, student Susan Elaine Rencourt disappeared in Ellensburg, 120 km from Seattle after a research meeting at the college's central library. Two female students later reported that on the evening of the abduction and 3 days before, they met a man with his arm in a sling outside the library who asked them to help him load a large number of books into his car, a Volkswagen Beetle. Roberta Kathleen Parks, 20, a student of art and world religion at Oregon State University in Corvallis, 420 km from Seattle, went missing on 6th May. She left her dormitory on the university campus around 11 p.m. for her usual evening walk, telling her roommate she would be back in an hour. But Kathleen never returned, that day or the next. Nobody saw anything. Nobody remembered anything. The girl just vanished into thin air. As Bundy himself later said, he went to a bar in the Student Union building, saw a girl sitting alone drinking coffee, sat down, introduced himself as a student, and struck up a conversation. When he realized that the girl liked him, he invited her to a restaurant half an hour away from campus. Kathleen agreed and went with Bundy, thus falling into his hands. On the night of the 1st of June, Brenda Carol Ball went missing from Berrien, a suburb of Seattle, Washington, after a party at the Flame Tavern Cafe. She was last seen at 2 a.m., outside the cafe talking to a Shawshank man with his arm in a sling. Georgiana Hawkins sat around 1 a.m. on June 11th. University of Washington student Georgiana Hawkins mysteriously disappeared on the university campus while walking along a lit road from her boyfriend's dormitory to her dormitory, which are 40 meters apart. The next morning, the entire road was scoured by Seattle detectives and crime scene investigators, but they found nothing. Witnesses testified that they saw a man on crutches with a plastered leg near the dormitory trying to drag a suitcase. One woman said he asked her to help him carry the suitcase into a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. At the time, Bundy was working for the Washington State Department of Emergency Services, DES, a government agency that, among other things, searches for missing persons. There he met and began dating Carol Ann Boone, a twice-divorced woman with 2 children. She would later become his wife. The disappearance of 6 women and the brutal beating of Sparks were covered in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. Fear spread among the population. Law enforcement was hard-pressed, but the paucity of evidence made their work very difficult. Police officials did not share even the little they knew with reporters for fear of damaging the investigation. Some similarities between the victims were noted. They all disappeared at night, often near where construction work was taking place, and shortly before exams all the victims were wearing trousers or jeans. In most cases, a man with a bandage or plaster cast was seen at the scene of the crime, driving a Volkswagen Beetle. Events culminated on 14th July when 2 women were abducted in broad daylight on a crowded beach at Park Lake Sammamish in Issaquah, a town 32 km from Seattle. The 5 women described the abductor as an attractive man in a white tennis suit with his left arm in a sling, with a slight accent similar to British or Canadian. He introduced himself as Ted. He asked them to help load the sailboat onto his car, a Volkswagen Beetle. 4 refused. 1, Mary Osmer, went with him. When they approached the car, she saw that the sailboat was not near the car. Asking where the boat was, she was told that she had to go to his parents' house, which was right up the hill here, to get the sailboat. Referring to the fact that her parents were waiting for her, the girl hurriedly left. 3 witnesses sunbathing on the beach next to the attractive blonde Janice Ann Auty. A supervisor in Seattle Juvenile Court saw the man approach the girl and ask her to go with him to his parents' house in Issaquah to help him bring a boat from there. Despite the obvious absurdity of the request, Janice Ott agreed, saying that she would steer the sailboat herself when he returned. Apparently, Auty thought the request was just flirting on the part of the handsome man. The couple left the beach talking animatedly. 4 hours later, Bundy was led off the beach by Denise Nasland, who had left her sunbathing friends to visit the washroom. She was last seen talking to a man in a tennis suit with his arm in a sling. No one else saw the girls alive. Bundy later told biographer Stephen Mykod that when he brought Denise Nasland to his hideout, Janice Ann Ott was still alive. He raped and murdered them, one girl in front of the other, but shortly before his execution, according to his lawyer Polly Nelson, he allegedly recanted that statement. Soon flyers describing Bundy and his car were distributed throughout Seattle and the immediate area. His sketch was shown in the press and on television. Elizabeth Klepfer, Ann Rule, a DES employee and a University of Washington psychology professor, identified Ted Bundy from them, but detectives, who received 200 messages a day, overlooked the law student with no criminal record. On 6 September, 2 grouse hunters came across the remains of Ott lower jaw, femur bones and hair, and Nasland skull, femur bones, hair, and rib cage with several ribs 3.2 km from Lake Sammamish Park in the woods, in dense brush. Several extra bones, thigh bones, and several vertebrae found at the same site were later identified by Bundy himself as the remains of Georgiana Hawkins. 6 months later, on 2nd March 1975, the remains of Healy Mandible, Rancourt Skull and Mandible, Park Skull and Mandible, and Ball Skull and Mandible were found in a wooded thicket on Mount Taylor, not far east of Issaquah. The remains of Donna Gale Manson were never found. Idaho, Utah, Colorado. In August 1974, Bundy entered the University of Utah to study law and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Klopfer in Seattle. Although he called her frequently, he dated at least a dozen other women. During his studies, he was frustrated with his own mental abilities. He did not understand the syllabus, and other students had an intellectual advantage over him, even though he was studying law for the 2nd time. In Utah, he also became a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but did not become an active member and violated many Mormon restrictions. When asked after his arrest what religion he identified himself as, Bundy said he considered himself a Methodist. Bundy's new murders went unnoticed until he himself confessed to them shortly before his execution. On 2nd September, he raped and strangled a hitherto unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho. He either dumped the corpse in a nearby river or left it, and returned the next day to photograph and dismember his victim. On 2nd October, he killed 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. According to Bundy, he tried to limit his pathological desires by only raping his victims but not killing them. Wilcox he killed accidentally when he tried to silence her. He buried Wilcox in Capitol Reef Park, but her remains have not been found. On the evening of 18th October, Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the local police chief, disappeared in the small Mormon town of Midvale, another Salt Lake City suburb, while returning home. Melissa Smith went to a restaurant half a kilometer from her home to talk to a friend who worked there who had been dumped by a boyfriend. After the conversation, she went home around 10 p.m. 9 days later, her naked body was found at Summit Park, in the Wasatch Mountains, 30 kilometers from Salt Lake City. An autopsy revealed she had been alive for 7 days after her disappearance. On the night of 31st October, 17-year-old Laura Ann Amy disappeared on her way home from a coffee shop 35 km from Lehigh. Her body was discovered by hikers 7 days later, on Thanksgiving Day, at American Fork Canyon in the Winter Wasatch Wildlife Refuge. Both women were brutally beaten, raped, and strangled with nylon stockings. Years later, Bundy described the rituals he performed on the now dead girls. He shampooed their hair and applied makeup. On the evening of November 8th, Daranch drove her car to the Fashion Place Mall, about a kilometer from the pizzeria where Melissa Smith was last seen. While walking through the mall, Carol stopped near a bookstore window to look at books. There, Bundy approached her around 7:30 p.m., identified himself as Officer Roseland, and told her that someone had tried to break into her car. Bundy asked her to go with him to the police station to file a report. It was already dark outside when Bundy led the girl to his vehicle. She was greatly surprised that the police officer was not driving a police car, but a shabby Volkswagen Beetle. When asked to show her badge, Bundy only twirled his wallet in Daranch's face. It was strange and suspicious, but the girl allowed the idea that there was an undercover officer in front of her and got into the car. Bundy took off sharply and drove his Volkswagen, but not toward the police station, but away from it. When he turned onto a street and braked sharply, the girl immediately opened the door and rushed out of the car, but Bundy caught her by the arm, dragged her back into the cabin, and snapped the handcuffs on her right hand. The girl began to struggle desperately, hitting him, scratching him, biting him. In the heat of the struggle, Bundy also fastened the second bracelet on her right arm. Then Carol shoved Bundy away and jumped out of the car. Bundy rushed after her, holding his crowbar in his hand. He grabbed her and pinned her against the bonnet of the car, trying to hit her in the head. However, the girl fought back desperately, intercepting his arm with the crowbar. The fierce struggle ended with Carol kicking Bundy in the groin with all her might, breaking free and rushing towards the approaching car. That same evening at about 10 p.m., 17-year-old Deborah Kent, a student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, a 20-minute drive from Murray, went missing. She went missing during a school theater production. At intermission, Deborah decided to pick up her younger brother from the skateboard area. She went to her car in the car park outside the school and disappeared. Police officers searching the car park later found Carol Daranch's handcuff key. During the performance, Bundy was seen by students and the acting teacher, 24-year-old Raylan Shepard. According to Shepard, before the play began, an unknown man approached her in the school hallway and asked her to help him find his car in the car park. She apologized, replied that she was busy, and left to go about her business. At halftime, the man approached her again, staring at her breasts and telling her that he had been staring at her, that he liked her a lot, especially her long black hair, and that she should go with him now to help him find his car. Shepard turned away in disgust and walked away. In November, Elizabeth Klopfer, having read that young women were going missing in towns near Salt Lake City, called the police again. Detective Hergesheimer questioned her at length. After that, suspicions about Bundy grew, but witnesses from Lake Sammamish, whom police considered the most reliable, did not identify him from the photo. In December, Klopfer contacted the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and reiterated her suspicions. Bundy was added to the list of suspects, but nothing serious linked him to the Utah murders. In January 1975, he returned to Seattle after exams and spent a week with Klopfer. She did not tell Ted that she had reported him to the police 3 times and planned to visit him in Salt Lake City in August. In 1975, he moved his criminal activities east to Colorado. On 12th January, 23-year-old nurse Karen Campbell mysteriously disappeared at the Snowmass Village Resort in Colorado. After going for a moment, from the hotel lobby, where she was sitting with her fiancé, to her room to get a magazine, she disappeared. She was last seen leaving the lift on her floor. A month later, her naked body was accidentally discovered in a snowdrift in an abandoned area outside the resort. She had been struck on the head with a blunt object and strangled. Her body was covered with cuts. On March 15th, Julie Cunningham, a ski instructor, disappeared on her way to her condo in Vale, 160 kilometers from Snowmass Village. Bundy later told Colorado investigators that he approached her on crutches and asked for help carrying her ski boots to her car, where he stunned and handcuffed her before raping and strangling her in a remote location near the town of Rifle, 140 kilometers from Vale. A few weeks later, he returned to the scene of the crime to view Julie's remains. Denise Oliverson, 25, went missing April 6th near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction while riding her bicycle to her parents' home. Her bicycle and sandals were found under a motorway overpass. On May 6th, Bundy lured 12-year-old Lynette Culver, who was returning from school in Pocatello, Idaho, into his vehicle. He took her to a motel where he raped her and drowned her in a bathtub before abusing her dead body again. He later dumped the body in the Snake River. In mid-May, 3 of Bundy's colleagues, including Carol Ann Boone, stayed with him for a week in Salt Lake City. In June, Bundy joined Klopfer in Seattle for a week, and they decided to get married at Christmas. Bundy did not tell her that he was still in a relationship with Boone or about his affair with a Utah law student known as Kim Andrews or Sharon Auer. On 27th June, 15-year-old Susan Curtis of Bountiful, Utah, and 2 friends rode their bicycles to the Brigham Young University campus for a youth conference. That evening, after a formal dinner in the Student Center banquet hall, Susan went to her dormitory, which was a 5-minute walk away, and disappeared. The girl was never seen again. The kidnapping and murder of Curtis was Bundy's last confession. It was recorded minutes before the execution. The bodies of Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Culver, Curtis, and Oliverson were never found. Arrest and first trial. Bundy was first arrested in August 1975 in Granger when he refused to stop for a routine check ordered by a highway patrol officer. A search of his car revealed a ski mask, a tights mask, a crowbar, rubbish bags, a coil of rope, handcuffs, an ice pick, and other items commonly used in burglaries. Bundy explained that he needed the ski mask to ski, the handcuffs he found on a bin, and the rest were just household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson recalled that a similar man and car were wanted for the Darrange kidnapping, as well as Ted Bundy's name, which was given by Klepfer. Police searched his flat but found no hard evidence against Bundy. He later said they didn't find photos of his victims, which he hid in a back room. Bundy was released on bail. Salt Lake City police placed Bundy under 24-hour surveillance, and Thompson and 2 other detectives went to Seattle to take a statement from Klopfer. She told them that in the year before Bundy left for Utah, she had found items in his possession that she could not explain: a set of crutches, a bag of plaster, a butcher knife never used for cooking, surgical gloves, an oriental-looking knife in a wooden case, and a bag of women's clothing. She also remembered that Bundy was always going around in debt to everyone. She suspected that everything he had of substance Bundy had stolen. One day when she started to find out the origin of the new TV in stereo, Bundy warned her that if she told anyone, he would break her neck. He also got very upset every time she cut off her long hair. Sometimes she would wake up to Bundy examining her body under the blanket with a torch in his hands. He kept a lug spanner in the boot of her car. She also owned the very Volkswagen Beetle that Bundy often borrowed, ostensibly for protection. Detectives discovered that Bundy was not with Klopfer on the nights the girls disappeared. A little later, Seattle homicide detective Kathy McKesney took a statement from Klopfer and learned of the existence of Stephanie Brooks and their 1973 engagement to Bundy.in September. Bundy sold the Volkswagen to a Midvale resident. It was impounded by Utah police, and FBI technicians disassembled and examined the car. They found hair that matched that of Karen Campbell. Strands of hair from Melissa Smith and Carol Darrange were also found, but they were deemed microscopically indistinguishable. FBI lab worker Robert Neal concluded that finding strands of hair in one car, which happened to be there, from 3 different victims who had never met in their lifetime, would be a coincidence of staggering rarity. On 2nd October 1975, Daranch identified Bundy as Officer Roseland. Bountiful witnesses also identified him as the stranger hanging around outside the school where Deborah Kent disappeared during a theater production. There was not enough evidence to convict him in the Deborah Kent case, but there was more than enough to charge him with kidnapping and attempted assault on Daranch. He was released on $15,000 bail, paid for by his parents. He spent most of the time between arraignment and trial at the Cloepfer home in Seattle. Despite his release, he was closely watched. When we went out anywhere, Klopfer wrote, "So many police cars started up behind us that it was like starting the Indianapolis 500 miles. In November, the three lead investigators in the Bundy case, Jerry Thompson of Utah, Robert Keppel of Washington, and Michael Fisher of Colorado, met and exchanged information with other investigators from 5 states in Aspen. As they left the meeting later to become known as the Aspen Summit, they decided that serious evidence had to be gathered before Bundy could be charged with the other murders, even though they were sure he was the killer. In November, the 3 lead investigators in the Bundy case, Jerry Thompson of Utah, Robert Keppel of Washington, and Michael Fisher of Colorado, met and exchanged information with other investigators from 5 states in Aspen. As they left the meeting later to become known as the Aspen Summit, they decided that serious evidence had to be gathered before they could accuse Bundy of the other murders, even though they were sure he was the killer. On 23 February 1976, Ted Bundy went on trial for the kidnapping of Carol Daranch. On the advice of his lawyer, John O'Annall, he exercised his right to a jury trial. On 1 May, after 4 days of trial and 2 days of deliberation, the judge found him guilty of kidnapping and assault. Bundy was sentenced to 15 years in Utah State Prison. In October, he was found hiding behind bushes in the prison yard. He was holding an escape kit, road maps, plane schedules, and a Social Security card. For that, he spent several weeks in solitary confinement. A month later, Utah authorities charged him with the murder of Karen Campbell. To that end, he was transported to Aspen in January 1977. Jailbreak. On 7th June 1977, Bundy was transported from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, to the Pitkin County Courthouse for a preliminary hearing. He chose to defend himself, so he was not handcuffed or shackled. During a recess, he asked to visit the library at the courthouse to do some research on his case. Hiding behind a book rack, he opened a window, jumped from the first floor, spraining his right ankle, and fled. He made his way out of town via Mount Aspen. He rested in a hunting cabin near the summit for a few days. Then he traveled south to the town of Crested Butte, but got lost in the woods and wandered aimlessly for 2 days. On June 10th, Bundy broke into a camping trailer at Maroon Lake, 16 kilometers from Aspen, stealing food and a parka. 3 days later, he stole a car from the grounds of the Aspen Golf Club. Cold, sleep-deprived, and suffering from constant ankle pain, Bundy drove back to Aspen, where his car was spotted by 2 police officers. He was on the run for 6 days. Brought back to Glenwood Springs, Bundy ignored the advice of his friends and legal advisors to stay there. The initially weak case against him for the kidnapping and murder of Karen Campbell was crumbling before his eyes. Several findings in Bundy's favor were made, and some of the direct evidence was ruled inadmissible. A more rational defendant would have realized that he had a good chance of being acquitted in the Karen Campbell case. That might have dissuaded other prosecutors of his guilt. And then another 1.5 years of work on the Daranch case, and he could have been a free man. Instead, Bundy cooked up a new escape plan. He got a hacksaw blade, and within 6 months had amassed $500 in cash. The money was passed to him by visitors, particularly Carol Ann Boone. He made a small hole in the ceiling of his cell. Bundy, who had lost a lot of weight, was able to squeeze through it. In the weeks that followed, he made several test runs, exploring the perimeter. An informant told officers that he could hear movement in Bundy's cell at night, but this was not verified. On 23 December 1977, it was decided to move the trial to another judicial district, Colorado Springs. On 30th December, Bundy used books and documents to make it appear that his body was lying on a bunk bed and escaped. He broke into the flat of the warden, who had gone out for the evening with his wife, changed into his clothes, and went out the front door. Bundy stole a car and drove east of Glenwood Springs, but the vehicle soon broke down. A passing motorcyclist gave Bundy a ride to Vail. There he boarded a bus for Denver, and from Denver he flew to Chicago. Ted Bundy's disappearance was not discovered until 17 hours later, at noon on the 31st. At that time, Bundy was already in Chicago. Events in Florida. From Chicago, Bundy traveled to Ann Arbor, Michigan. After 5 days, he stole a car and traveled to Atlanta, where he took a bus to Tallahassee. There, under the alias Chris Hagen, he rented a room near Florida State University. Bundy later recounted that he planned to get a job and quit killing. He knew he could stay free in Florida as long as he didn't attract police attention, but he had to turn down the only offer of a construction job because the employer required a driver's license for identification. So Bundy began stealing food from shops and stealing credit cards from wallets left by customers in grocery carts. A week after arriving in Tallahassee, at approximately 2:45 on 15th January, Bundy entered a Florida State University dormitory through an unlocked back door. After entering Margaret Bowman's room, he brutally beat her with a log, stripped her naked, and then strangled the girl with her pantyhose. In the next room, he attacked Katie Cleaner, fracturing her skull, breaking her jaw and severely injuring her shoulder, and Karen Chandler, smashing her head, breaking her jaw, knocking out her teeth, and shattering her finger. As Tallahassee detectives later determined, all of this happened in just 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 people who nevertheless heard nothing. After leaving the dormitory, Bundy ran several blocks and broke into a house rented by 3 female students. Through a window, he entered the room of University of Florida student Cheryl Thomas, beat the sleeping student, dislocating her shoulder, breaking her jaw and skull, undressed her and masturbated her. Traces of semen were found on the sheet. The Florida trial and the marriage. Bundy was indicted for the murders and assault in a dormitory at the University of Florida. The trial was covered by more than 250 journalists from all 5 continents. It was also the first trial to be televised throughout the United States. Although the court appointed him 5 lawyers, Bundy again insisted on defending himself. The prosecution attempted to negotiate a plea agreement with Bundy. In exchange for confessing to the murders of Levy, Bowman, and Leach, they offered a 75-year sentence in lieu of the death penalty. The prosecution went along with this because the prospects of them losing the case were very high. For Bundy, however, it was not only a way to avoid the death penalty, but also a tactical move. He would agree to the deal, and after a while evidence could be lost or tainted, witnesses could die, move away, or withdraw their testimony. In such a case, the case against him could not be reinstated, and he could file a motion to set aside the agreement and secure an acquittal. However, at the last minute, Bundy declined the offer. Key evidence for the prosecution was the testimony of Connie Hastings, who saw Bundy on the dormitory grounds, and Nita Neary, who saw Bundy leaving the dormitory building with a log in his hands. Other evidence was a bite mark on Lisa Levy's buttock that matched Bundy's teeth. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours and found Bundy guilty of 2 murders, 3 attempted murders, and 2 thefts. The judge sentenced Bundy to death for the 2 dormitory murders. 6 months later, Bundy went on trial in Orlando for the kidnapping and murder of Kimberly Leach. Bundy was again found guilty and sentenced to death. The main evidence against him was the testimony of a woman who saw Bundy take the girl from the schoolyard to his van. Important material evidence was also fibers found on Leach's body, which matched fibers from the jacket Bundy was wearing at the time of his arrest. During the closing stages of the trial, Bundy unexpectedly proposed to her. Boone accepted, and Bundy announced that they were now married under Florida law. An oral declaration of marriage in the presence of a judge is considered a legal consummation of the marriage. Confessions and execution. Shortly after his trial for Leach's murder and the long appeals process, Bundy gave a series of interviews to McCall and Ainsworth, recounting everything mostly in the third person to avoid confession, where he first revealed details of his murders and way of thinking. He spoke at length about his thefts. He said he stole because he wanted to own things. "I really enjoyed owning anything," he said. Possession also acted as an important motive for rape and murder. Sexual violence, he said, fulfilled his need to completely own his victims. He first killed to avoid capture, but then killing became part of the adventure. Deprivation of life became a way to finally possess the victim, and sexual violence became a way to physically possess their remains. Bundy also confided in FBI agent William Hagemeyer of the Behavioral Analysis Unit. He was struck by the deep, almost mystical satisfaction Bundy derived from the murders. He said he didn't commit the murders because of lust or lust for violence. It was possession. It was a part of yourself. The victim became a part of you, and you the two became one forever. And the place where he killed or left the victim became sacred, and you were always drawn back to it, Hagemeyer recounted. Bundy initially considered himself an impulsive killer, an amateur, but later became a predator around the time he killed Linda Healy in 1974. This meant that he had, as suspected, started killing before 1974, although he himself never admitted it.
On the eve of his execution, Bundy talked to investigators about suicide. He didn't want to give the state a chance to admire his death, Hagemeyer said of it. On 24th January 1989 at 7:16 a.m. North American Eastern Time, Ted Bundy was executed by means of the electric chair at the Florida State Penitentiary in the municipality of Rayford. At the time of the execution, a crowd of about 2,000 people held a celebration right in front of the prison. They sang, danced, set off fireworks, and cheered as the hearse carried Bundy's body away from the prison. His remains were cremated in Gainesville and his ashes scattered at an undisclosed location in the Cascade Mountains according to his will.